Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and you've found your way to Kinda Murdery, a place that means more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories, the unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. Was the legend of Zorro inspired by a hate crime killer? The mystery behind this question is the subject of today's Kinda Murdery, as we attempt to disambiguate the legend of Joaquin Murrieta, the Robin Hood of El Dorado and the man who inspired Don Diego de la Vega, better known as Zorro. The true story, and here I place the word true in air quotes, of Joaquin Murrieta Outlaw, may in fact intersect with the legend of Joaquin Murrieta, the Robin Hood of California. But, like an awful game of telephone, the truth is far different and more terrible than the legend would have you believe. Hello everyone, I'm your host, Zevin Odelberg. Welcome to Kinda Murdery. Thank you for deciding to be here. At the beginning of every show, to anyone listening who is struggling with a disability or has a friend or family member who is struggling with a disability, physical or otherwise, I see you. You're not broken. You're loved. Kinda Murdery is here for you. I'm here for you. And if you feel alone in your struggles, if you feel like a friend, a community would help make things easier, reach out to the show, kindamurdery@gmail.com or @kindamurdery on social media. In fact, I'd like to quickly share one of my own struggling with a disability stories. Now, as I've mentioned before, I have cerebral palsy, and I'll be the first to tell you that by sheer luck of birth and access to corrective surgery, my difficulties are extremely minor when compared to what many disabled people face. If your challenges are more severe than mine and you'd rather not hear it from me, just hit the skip forward button a couple times and I won't blame you. On the flip side, I think there's value whenever we think about something that we've never thought about before, and whether that fresh perspective comes from a murder story or from a personal experience, the value remains. So here, if you're up for it, is a little snapshot of my real life. Let's call it Pet Peeve of an Able-Passing Disabled Podcaster. Or, more simply, Zevin's Nemesis, the shoe. I want to talk for a moment about the common practice of removing your shoes when you enter a home, or having others remove their shoes when they enter yours. Whether you're a real estate agent holding an open house, a person whose cultural background makes the practice commonplace, or whether you've simply arrived on your own at the conclusion that it is the more hygienic and therefore more civilized or even morally superior choice, and these are attitudes I see expressed on social media regularly, I'm here to share with you one disabled person's experience with the tradition of shoe removal upon entering a home. Because of the ways in which my left foot is oddly shaped and largely immobilized, I have very little to no muscular control over it. And the thought and act of taking my shoes off and putting them on has been a source of acute anxiety for me for as long as I can remember. I can't wear slip-ons or sandals because without unconscious muscular control, they won't stay on my feet, and I don't have the balance necessary to take shoes off or to put them on without sitting down. Depending on the situation or the shoe, trying to put shoes on can take me anywhere from 10 minutes to a half an hour, and it may involve swearing and sweating and possible failure altogether. I hate, and I do mean hate, having to deal with any of these shoe shenanigans in public, especially if there's nowhere to sit and I find myself, all 6'4", 200-something pounds of me, camped on the floor saying a silent prayer as I hope that my shoes will go on. Or come off. When I know I'm going somewhere where I'll have to take my shoes off, I dread it, even when it's the home of someone who I know and love. So here's what I'd request. Again, whether you're a real estate agent holding an open house or just someone who prefers no shoes inside, please, in case you have a guest with disability. It's even possible you won't realize they have a disability, but please make sure you provide somewhere to sit when dealing with the shoe thing. Also, if you could leave the disgust and moral judgments about the cleanliness and hygiene of people who leave their shoes on out of it, that would be awesome. Some of us might have another reason for wanting to keep our shoes on, besides being just totally cool with whatever nasty stuff is on the street underneath the soles of our feet. Thank you so much for hearing me out. It does feel good to exercise a pet peeve and also to just share the experience of being disabled without self-judgment. And if you listening have a story about living with a disability that you'd like to share, please do reach out to the show at kindamurdery@gmail.com. We can keep it between us, or if you'd like me to, I'd be happy to share it on the show. Again, reach out at kindamurdery@gmail.com. Today is an exciting episode for Kinda Murdery because I'm bringing you a story suggested by a listener, and that listener is Amber Suri. Amber asked me to investigate the legend of Joaquin Murrieta. Now, she did not tell me what I'd find, so if you don't like or don't agree with my conclusions, don't blame her. Go ahead and blame me. Email the show at kindamurdery@gmail.com or reach out on social media at kindamurdery. So, Amber, thanks again for reaching out, and boy, am I excited to tackle this one. And if you'd like to hear me cover a crime story that you're interested in, please reach out to the show. I'll say the email again, kindamurdery@gmail.com or at kindamurdery on social media. And while it's true that I often choose old cases to make it far less likely that I'll be exploiting the grief of survivors or any living family members and loved ones, I am not averse to covering more recent cases. I'll just do so with the awareness that they may require an extra measure of care and possible linguistic restraint, which is not my strong suit, as you know, but I can get better at it. So, if you're a more recent murder stan, feel free to suggest those too. I am here solely, well, almost solely, for your listening pleasure. But this week, I'm telling the story that Amber Suri suggested. And what a story it is. I bring you the incredible, in many cases literally incredible, tale of larger-than-life outlaw Joaquin Murrieta. Murrieta is thought to be the inspiration for the famed television and film swashbuckler Zorro, a hero whose trademark Z-cut carried him close to the heart of a young Zevon Odelberg. Because of the Z thing, obviously. Yep, Zevon Odelberg, that's me, talking about myself in the third person like a weirdo. Speaking of weirdos, shout out to any Weird Darkness weirdo family members who might be listening, and eternal thanks to Darren Marlar from Weird Darkness Podcast, from whom I have learned so much. Now back to the real Zorro, Joaquin Murrieta. Now if you Google it, and you only go on Wikipedia, now they'll tell you that Murrieta did not inspire Zorro, but they offer no support for this assertion other than the fact that the first Zorro book was written in 1919. Now, it's pretty obvious to me, as I'm sure it is to you, that there's no expiration date on inspiration. And outside of Wikipedia, which is frequently peppered with hogwash and should never be anyone's only source for anything, there seems to be fairly broad agreement that Joaquin Murrieta was, in fact, the inspiration for Zorro. So I'm going to stick to my guns, or I guess my sword and whips, on that one. Old West old-timers love to tell fish stories to burnish their own personal legends, and they, along with novelists, poets, and newspaper men, styled Joaquin Murrieta as a benevolent bandit who suffered horrific outrages at the hands of the authorities and as a result became California's Robin Hood, or Mexicalifornia's Zorro. Dealer's choice, your choice on which pop culture superhero icon better fits the real Joaquin Murrieta. In truth, the Murrieta Feliz gang was less merry men, and instead something closer to the James Younger gang. That's Jesse James and Cole Younger, a ruthless and violent bandit syndicate built around a core of family members who often were sheltered from the law by local people whose way of life was threatened by the changing status quo. And the deeper truth about Joaquin Murrieta and the Murrieta Feliz gang maybe even darker than that. It seems that Joaquin Murrieta, the Robin Hood of California, the man whose legend gave birth to Zorro, was not a champion of the common man, driven to a life of crime by the grotesque abuses of overpowered law enforcement and tyrannical governors. To this depiction of the real Murrieta, some scholars and historians offer a resounding no. Their contention? Joaquin Murrieta was no Robin Hood. He was, in fact, a serial murderer whose bloodlust was driven by greed and racial hatred. But that, if it is the truth, is hard to bear, especially for fans of Zorro and of Joaquin himself, long remembered fondly by Californians, of which I am one, as their very own Robin of Locksley. Full disclosure, I myself have long been a fan of both Zorro and Joaquin Murrieta, but I try not to let my personal feelings inform my research. At least not that much. So which one was the real Joaquin Murrieta? Was he a benevolent bandit or a serial murderer? Was he a warrior for justice, robbing the rich and giving to the poor, or was he a bloodthirsty, thrill-killing racist? Absent the strident moral hindsight of today, is it possible for both Joaquins to be real? These are the questions at the heart of our mystery as we attempt to uncover the truth behind the man who inspired the legend of Zorro. Who was the real Joaquin Murrieta? If you, like me, would like to get down to the brass tacks beneath the gilded lily, then keep your ear holes open and get ready for... Was Zorro a hate crime killer? The serial murders of Joaquin Murrieta. Now, before we dive into the fundamental question of who was the real Joaquin Murrieta, we must first acknowledge the legend of Joaquin Murrieta, popularized by the book The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, the Celebrated California Bandit, by John Rollin Ridge, published in 1854, one short year after Murrieta's death. Like Peter Parker bitten by a radioactive spider or Bruce Banner exposed to gamma radiation, Joaquin Murrieta's apocryphal, that's a fancy word for made-up, origin story goes like this. Joaquin Murrieta was a peace-loving man driven to seek revenge when he and his brother were falsely accused of stealing a mule. As a result, Joaquin's brother was hanged in front of him, and Joaquin was horsewhipped. Then, and fair warning, this is awful, so plug your ears if you need to, Joaquin's young wife was gang-raped to death, also in front of him, and died in his arms, swearing revenge on all those who had violated his sweetheart, and on all Anglos in general. Anglo was Rollin Ridge's preferred word for white people. Joaquin embarked on a short but violent career that brought death to his white tormentors. The state of California offered a reward for Joaquin of up to $5,000, dead or alive. In the end, Joaquin was hunted down, killed, and mutilated by a drunken brute of a man named Harry Love, captain of the California Rangers, California's first statewide law enforcement agency. Murrieta was decapitated. Then his severed head was pickled in brandy and taken on a tour throughout the mining camps of the Old West, where Murrieta's likeness was well known, to demonstrate to everyone that the scourge of California had indeed been destroyed, and to let people know that they no longer need to live in fear. In particular, the many Chinese miners in the camps, but we'll return to that later. And of course, this tour was not just meant to comfort, but also to demonstrate the dire consequences of a bandit's life to anyone who might consider picking up Murrieta's mantle. In fact, Joaquin Murrieta's brandy-pickled head would go on periodic tours throughout Old West California over the next 50 years, until it was destroyed in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake and subsequent fire. If you'd like to hear another story about a decapitation and a traveling severed head, check out Kinda Murdery's March 13th, 2022 episode, The Decapitation of Eddie King, with Derek Hayes from Monsters Among Us podcast. Also, be sure to check out Monsters Among Us podcast. Derek does a phenomenal job. Monsters Among Us is a tremendous paranormal podcast. I like to call Derek the king of the things that go bump in the night. So check out Monsters Among Us podcast. Now, back to the origin story of Joaquin Murrieta. Wait, you may be thinking, I heard you before. How dare you imply or assert that the origins of the beloved Robin Hood of El Dorado, progenitor of the even more beloved pop culture icon Zorro, were largely fabricated? How dare I assert that? Well, as I've already said, this hero's backstory, as terrible and compelling a story of downtrodden injustice as ever there was, came from John Rollin Ridge's seminal work, The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta, the Celebrated California Bandit. And as we unravel the mystery of the real Joaquin Murrieta, we're forced to acknowledge that no account of the legendary outlaw could possibly be complete, and no mystery about the truth of his life could be solved without first understanding the life and mystery of John Rollin Ridge. And so, it is perhaps fitting that his story be told alongside his most popular creation. Ridge, born in the Cherokee Nation, what is now Georgia, in 1827, was a sometime newspaperman, poet, and frontiersman, and eventual novelist who was half white and half Cherokee. Like Joaquin Murrieta, the folk hero he would create, Ridge was no stranger to violence and death. In 1839, when he was only 12, 3 members of Ridge's family were murdered. Ridge, or Yellowbird's family, were leaders of the Cherokee faction that wanted to accommodate the federal government, and they were instrumental in signing the treaty that would result in the genocidal Trail of Tears migration. It was understood that the Ridge family murders were vengeance killings carried out by members of the rival Cherokee faction that blamed the Ridge family for the horrors of the Trail of Tears. Even at the tender age of 12, proximity to the murder of his family members inspired John Rollin Ridge's desire to be active in Cherokee Nation politics and to avenge the deaths of his family and wrest the leadership of the tribe away from the rival faction, whom he saw as deeply misguided. Ridge's viewpoint on this was of course informed by his family's murder, the obvious horror of the Trail of Tears notwithstanding. But Rollins Ridge was not only Cherokee. His mother was white, and his desire to take an active role in the future of the Cherokee Nation was almost immediately derailed when John was sent to the East Coast to be educated. John Rollin Ridge's parents likely sent him away because John, aka Yellowbird, was an obvious target for assassins. I mentioned that Rollins Ridge, like his creation, the popularized Murrieta, was no stranger to violent death, and in fact the murder of his family members was not the end of his terrible acquaintance with mortality. 10 years after his family's murder, in 1849, when he was 22 and still in New England, Ridge shot and killed a man in a brawl, and that killing would prove to be the inciting incident that perhaps even more than the real Murrieta himself was responsible for giving birth to Murrieta's legend. Rather than stick around to be prosecuted for murder by authorities in New England, Ridge fled to Missouri, and then from there he fled further to what he correctly perceived to be even greater safety, at least from the long arm of the law. Like so many other 49ers, men with gold fever in 1849, Rollin Ridge hightailed it to the gold fields of Northern California, and it was there that he encountered stories of a notorious local outlaw named Joaquin Murrieta. Now, perhaps you're familiar with the party game Two Truths and a Lie, where you go around a circle and everyone makes 3 statements about themselves, and then the group has to guess which 2 are true and which one is false. Well, in the famed origin story of Joaquin Murrieta as popularized by John Rollin Ridge aka Yellowbird, we have 4 truths and at least 8 lies, making this story materially false. Let's recap the origin story. Murrieta is a man of peace. Brother is falsely accused of stealing a mule. Brother is hanged and Joaquin is horsewhipped. Joaquin's wife is publicly gang raped to death in front of him and dies in his arms. He becomes a bandit to support the poor Mexican people of California and to wreak havoc and righteous vengeance on his white tormentors. A $5,000 reward is offered for his capture, dead or alive, and he is eventually killed by an alcoholic monster named Harry Love. He's decapitated, his head is pickled in brandy, and Joaquin's brandy-pickled head in a jar is paraded through the mining camps of Northern California. So I said 4 truths and approximately 8 lies, right? So let's start with the truths. What are the truths? Truth number 1. Joaquin Murrieta, aka Joaquin Carrillo, was a bandit. Truth number 2. He was killed by Harry Love. Truth number 3. He was decapitated. Truth number 4. His severed head was pickled in brandy and paraded through the mining camps of Northern California. Now, just those 4 truths are almost unbelievable. They are freaking incredible, and they're all well-documented historical facts. So I just want to say, everybody, don't you dare be disappointed that every bit of Joaquin Murrieta's story isn't true, because gosh darn, I've heard a lot more believable lies than Joaquin Murrieta's 4 truths. So let's talk about the lies. Number 1. There is no evidence that Murrieta or his brother was accused of stealing a mule. Number 2. There is no evidence he was publicly horsewhipped. 3. There is no evidence his brother was publicly hanged in front of him. And 4. There is no evidence that his wife was publicly raped, let alone publicly gang raped to death in front of him and dying in his arms. Gosh, that feels awful to say out loud. And even knowing that it was made up, it still feels awful. More mistruths in the origin story. Number 7. Joaquin did not become a bandit to avenge his murdered wife because she wasn't murdered. And number 8. He did not swear in either his wife or his brother's name to kill white people. And number 9, I may have lost count by now, there was never a $5,000 reward offered for him. That would be almost $200,000 today, by the way. But wait, you might say. How dare I give the lie to so many pieces of the origin story of such a beloved Old West hero as Joaquin Murrieta? Especially so many sympathetic details. Well, I've probably repeated it too many times now, but this version of the Murrieta story comes from the book by John Rollins Ridge, The Life and Adventures of Joaquin Murrieta. And it was a very, very, very important book. Not so much for what it had to say about the real Joaquin Murrieta, but for what it was. And what was that, you may ask? Well, here's the thing. John Rollins Ridge was not a historian or a biographer, as he is sometimes misidentified. He was an august and important man, however. You see, John Rollins Ridge, whose Cherokee name was Yellowbird, was the first Native American novelist. His swashbuckling account of Joaquin Murrieta was the first novel published in the newly minted state of California, and it was also the first American novel featuring a Mexican protagonist. These are all extremely important moments in American history. That a single writer and a single book made them all possible is amazing. Unfortunately for fans of Joaquin Murrieta, the historical importance of Ridge's work doesn't make it true. In fact, novels, as I'm sure you're aware, even novels based on true events, are by their very definition not true. If they were, they would be histories or biographies or autobiographies. However, it was the very popularity of Ridge's work that would eventually have it mistaken for a history. The work was so wildly popular that it was widely plagiarized in newspapers all over the country and reprinted in countries all over the world. Originally written in English, it was printed in both Spanish and French. It was reprinted in Chile, and Joaquin became Chilean. It was printed again in Mexico, and they changed him back to a Mexican. It was plagiarized and reprinted on the east coast of the U.S., where he became Joaquin Miller. Anywhere where people loved rakish heroes, which is to say everywhere, Rollins Ridge's account of the life and adventures of Joaquin Murrieta was plagiarized or reprinted with small or material changes, like Joaquin being Chilean, that would help to brand him and make him belong to the local community where the printing occurred even more. And of course, because people tend to view themselves and those like them as innately virtuous, their local bandit must be virtuous too. When I was a kid in the 90s, I used to love to watch the Ghostbusters cartoon. I remember a particular episode where the Ghostbusters captured the ghost of Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, and just before they were about to be sucked down into the ghost trap, Ray asked Sherlock, "Wait a minute, how is it possible that you guys have ghosts? You aren't real, you were never alive." Paraphrasing Sherlock's answer, the great detective told Ray, "Well, we lived in people's imaginations and were beloved to such an extent that we took on a life of our own, and because of the power of imagination, we now have ghosts." I think this is a fairly apt metaphor for the story of Joaquin Murrieta. Essentially, his legend was so beloved that he became real. But of course, it was merely Yellowbird's account of Joaquin's life that was fictional, not the man himself. So what do we know about the real Joaquin Murrieta? First, I should tell you that if you just do a cursory Googling of Joaquin Murrieta, you'll find a plethora of articles, some of them better described really as blog posts, telling you that historians describing Murrieta as little more than a violent bandit are maliciously turning a Mexican hero into a criminal. Or, on the other hand, you'll find such august academic institutions as the Paris Review, claiming that Joaquin Murrieta never existed at all, but was rather an amalgamation of 5 different outlaws named Joaquin. Now, I'm not sure exactly where the, what I'm going to call, depersoning of Joaquin Murrieta, that is, claiming that he never existed in the first place, ranks on the list of sins. I mean, is it worse to say that a folk hero never existed at all, or that he was actually a violent bandit rather than a high-minded hero? Which is historically pretty damn likely of any bandit living in the Old West, regardless of their heritage. Here's the thing, right? The past and the people who lived there already happened so many decades before the preferred social justice narratives of today. And attempts to shoehorn American history into acceptable narratives by 2022 standards are laughable at best, maddening, and fundamentally disingenuous at worst. So keep in mind that the content to come is just one podcaster's attempt at disambiguation, and it's not necessarily the truth. But I'm going to level with you. The retroactive moral recoding of history drives me bonkers. Treating the inability to comprehend nuance as a virtue, or failing to understand that people can contain multitudes. Multitudes that can be in direct opposition to each other, without necessarily nullifying one or the other's quality. That kind of block-headed moral certainty, it drives me nuts. Opposite things about one person can in fact both be true. Thomas Jefferson, for example, can be a slave owner and also an architect of American freedom, even though slavery and freedom are diametrically opposed concepts. It is possible for one man to embody them both. Hypocrisy as the greatest of all sins is a very new development, and it grew out of our loss of shared reality, and our insistence that there's no such thing as objective truth, because if nothing exists objectively outside of ourselves and our perception, then we become the only constant in our reality. And in that bizarre take on reality, if we are the only constant, then hell yes, hypocrisy is terrifying. If everything is mutable, the only things that must not be changeable are our beliefs, right? Zealotry is our anchor. It's our only shelter in the storm. Am I right? No, I'm wrong. In actual reality, the one that exists outside of ourselves, hypocrisy is not the greatest of all sins, no matter how much we yell about it. It's not worse than murder. It's not worse than assault. It's not even worse than abandoning your family for a midlife crisis and a younger wife with new boobs. And yet, most often we as a society are ready to forgive any of those sins quicker and with more ease and grace than we are willing to give up on torching a hypocrite for the horrible sin of doing the only thing that even makes it possible for us to work together, and that is changing their mind. So again, I could be wrong, but no one knows for sure Joaquin Murrieta's true story, and no one ever claimed to know for sure, except for one man who wrote a novel and never said it was anything other than a work of fiction. We do, however, know that a man named Joaquin Murrieta existed, and actual historians have written about him extensively. What follows is my attempt to share with you the real, in air quotes, version of the facts, in air quotes, of his life that passed the smell test for me. Now, thank you for allowing me to rant, and here we go. The real Joaquin Murrieta. Church records tell us that a bandit remembered as Joaquin Murrieta was born in Sonora, Mexico in 1830 to his parents Joaquin and Rosalia Murrieta. Rosalia had previously been married to a man named Carrillo, and later Joaquin would sometimes call himself Joaquin Carrillo, which gave rise to the legend of many Joaquins, as cited by the Paris Review and others. To be fair to the Paris Review, they don't exactly say that Murrieta didn't exist at all, but rather that a Joaquin Murrieta, spelled M-U-R-I-A-T-I, almost sounds Italian, was one of 5 bandit Joaquins. Apologies in advance if I butcher some of these surnames. The 5 Joaquins were Joaquin Acomarenia, Joaquin Valenzuela, Joaquin Botelier, and Joaquin Carrillo. And of course, Joaquin, apparently, Murrieta. And people who prescribe to this take on Murrieta's legend ascribe no particular importance to Joaquin Murrieta himself in the history of California banditry, preferring to make him just one of 5 bandits who seem to have been, but for John Rollin Ridge's novel, equally important or not. That's why I referred to this take as a depersoning of Murrieta, as the Paris Review essentially asserts that he was no more or less important than any other simultaneous bandit named Joaquin. If you want to blame somebody for knocking down Joaquin Murrieta, I suggest the Paris Review. I think that the far more likely explanation is that newspapers in the 1800s made shit up. They were the TV and movies of the day, and Joaquin Murrieta was a marquee name. He sold papers. He put butts in seats. He was Tom Cruise or Will Smith before the slap. The fact that he was in too many places at once means that crimes he didn't commit were attributed to him to sell papers. Not that he was some kind of golem made up of every contemporaneous Mexican outlaw named Joaquin, or that he did not exist at all. Next, did Joaquin Murrieta actually inspire Zorro? Wikipedia notwithstanding, Joaquin Murrieta did inspire Zorro. You can easily research this yourself if you care to, but the short version is this. Zorro was a fictionalized, genteel version of Bandit King Joaquin Murrieta, a mythological ideal that never really existed, created to contrast with the brutally murderous reality of the genuine article. Similarly, Zorro operated in a fictionalized, genteel version of Spanish California that didn't really exist. It was a mythological ideal that never was, created to contrast with the harsh and brutally murderous reality of California in the 1850s. Now, before we get any further into the real story of the real Joaquin Murrieta, I want to quickly and specifically address the truths and lies in his fabled origin story. Fabrications 1 through 3. Joaquin's brother was wrongfully accused of stealing a mule, Joaquin was horsewhipped, and his brother was hanged in front of him. There are no court documents, newspaper articles, or contemporaneous accounts of a young Joaquin or his brother being wrongfully accused of stealing a mule. The same goes for being publicly horsewhipped and for Joaquin's poor brother being hanged in front of him. Now, before you say, yeah, but it might have happened anyway, before we make this a referendum on the abuses of frontier justice, of which there were obviously, underline the word obviously, many, many, many abuses, consider this. Not only was Joaquin's brother not hanged in front of him, family records show that he returned to Mexico and was still alive in 1860, some 7 years after Joaquin was killed. So he clearly was not hanged in front of Joaquin at the very same time that Murrieta became an outlaw. He was not hanged at all. That was fabrications 1 through 3. Fabrications 4 through 8-ish, or possibly 9. And again, this is terrible. Fabrication being Joaquin's wife was publicly gang raped to death in front of him and died in his arms. That is horrible. However, it almost certainly did not happen. Women were extremely rare in the mining camps of 1850. And as a result of the lack of women, the rape of women was also extremely rare and extensively reported on when it did occur. Again, there are no court documents, newspaper articles, or accounts of any kind other than Rollin Ridge's novel, emphasis on the word novel, regarding the public gang rape to death and dying in Joaquin's arms of Joaquin's wife, Rosa Feliz Murrieta. Now, it should go without saying that many rapes go unreported. I am not obtuse. However, in the specific case of the legend of Joaquin Murrieta, his wife, Rosa Feliz, or Rosa Carrillo Murrieta, was not just raped. She was publicly gang raped to death. This almost certainly could not have occurred without comment. And since we know that Joaquin's brother was not hanged, but rather returned to Mexico and was alive as late as 1860, those facts put the probable lie to the rest of Joaquin's noble backstory. There was never a $5,000 reward offered for him. Now, the legend goes that Joaquin himself signed the $5,000 wanted poster and offered $10,000 for his own capture, dead or alive. But again, no evidence of the reward or of Joaquin's show of bravado is available. Okay, on to the next fabrication. Joaquin Murrieta swore revenge on Anglos, Anglo being Rollin Ridge's word for white people, for the hanging of his brother and for the rape of his wife Rosa. And at this pledge to kill white people, this is where the true story of Joaquin Murrieta takes a turn for the much, much darker. But before we expose that darkness to the light, let's return briefly to the beginning of Joaquin Murrieta's true story. We know he was born in Sonora in 1830. We know that the young Joaquin eventually married Rosa Feliz of Vallareca, Mexico. Apologies, I know I must have mispronounced that. They, Joaquin and Rosa, along with Jesus Murrieta and Rosa's 3 brothers, went to California upon news of the gold strike. Rosa's brother Claudio Feliz began gold mining with white partners near Sonora, while Joaquin and his bride eventually moved to Niles Canyon, then part of Contra Costa County. In these early years, there is evidence that Joaquin worked as a vaquero near Oakley and Brentwood in 1850, and as a Mustang catcher. From court and newspaper accounts, the first we hear of the Murrieta Feliz gang, remember, this was California's James Younger gang, the first we hear of their brush with the law was in 1849, when Claudio was arrested for stealing another miner's gold. The evidence of his guilt proved overwhelming. However, Claudio was able to escape from the Stockton jail and launch a new career. By 1850, he was the leader of one of the most vicious bands of outlaws ever to have preyed upon the white, Asian, and Hispanic communities of California. The Murrieta Feliz Carrillo gang, like the notorious James Younger gang, was a group of violent outlaws built around a family core. Their actions and murders were largely driven by greed and opportunity, not, as has been reported or written in Yellowbird's book, a special vendetta against white people. They were perfectly willing to rob and murder Hispanic people and the Goldfields' sizable Chinese population as well. In fact, in 1851, when the gang was led by Rosa's brother Claudio Feliz, they robbed the home of a powerful Hispanic family and made the mistake of leaving a witness alive. Feliz's willingness to rob and murder his own people caused him to lose the support of the Hispanic community. The wealthy Californio Hispanic families of the time wielded great power and were deadly serious about enforcing the law and protecting their own. When he attacked them, Claudio Felice lost their protection and sealed his own death warrant. He was gunned down shortly thereafter, and Joaquin Murrieta inherited leadership of the gang. As for Murrieta's doom, it arrived with the murder of Major General Joshua Bean, leader of the state militia. The murder of Major General Bean generated enough rage with the powers that be to send Harry Love and the California Rangers, the first statewide law enforcement agency in California, after the Murrieta gang in earnest. I suppose you could think of the California Rangers as a prototype for the CHP, or California Highway Patrol. And, since Joaquin Murrieta was a highwayman, the shoe fits. Now, I've previously mentioned the $5,000 reward and Murrieta's supposed and essentially non-existent vendetta against white people, although I'm sure he had no great love for them. He generally preferred to be motivated by greed and opportunity. And when I mention those two things, the reward and the vendetta, I said here's where the true story of the real Joaquin Murrieta takes a turn for the much, much darker. Because at those 2 points, reward money and racially motivated murders, the legend does in fact intersect with the truth. But, like a horrible game of telephone, the truth is far different and much worse than the legend would have you believe. And now, we've finally arrived at the question embedded in the title of this episode. Was Zorro a hate crime killer? Murrieta and his gang were indeed responsible for many racially motivated murders, but not against white people. Instead, Chinese people in California's mining camps, who tended to be nonviolent and unarmed, were the favorite murder target of Joaquin and his gang. After Reyes Felice was hanged for the murder of General Bean in January of 1853, Joaquin Murrieta and his gang began the violent rampage that would make them notorious, infamous, and feared as the terrors of Northern California. Over the next 2 months, they killed 22 people, most of them Chinese miners, who had little property for the outlaws to steal. It appears that the majority of these killings were racially motivated, committed simply for the pleasure it gave the outlaws, which gives horrible significance to the fact that the majority of the murdered Chinese people were not shot and rarely robbed, like so many of Murrieta's victims, but rather had their throats cut. Horrifically, tragically, Joaquin Murrieta did have a racially motivated favorite target for his serial murders. But it wasn't white people. It was Chinese people. Now, you'll often hear it said that we shouldn't need to have a personal connection to something in order to feel empathy, and that's true. But I think that anyone with a family knows that personal connections certainly deepen the well and the strength of our emotion. Some of you may know, most of you may not, that my wife and daughter are Chinese American. And I'll be honest with you, I used to be someone who loved the legend of California's Robin Hood. And I did not know this about Murrieta until I started researching this episode of Kinda Murdery. Now, I'm sure anyone listening finds the serial murder of unarmed and nonviolent Chinese people to be horrific. The fact that Murrieta and his gang preferred to kill them by cutting their throats when this wasn't otherwise their modus operandi makes it all the more horrible. But I have to tell you, Murrieta's history of serial murdering Chinese people, especially because I discovered it now, in a moment in our history when Asian Americans are frequently the targets of savage and unjustifiable violence, absolutely upset me on a personal level in a way that most of the murder stories I research don't. I'm usually able to keep myself somewhat separate from the horror I cover. It's the only possible way to emotionally survive telling stories like this on a weekly basis. But guys, this one got to me. And it's part of the reason why you heard me get upset at the blogosphere for lecturing historians about supposedly recasting Murrieta as a villain. It's not a recasting. He was a villain with a capital V. And here we find one of the worst cases of selective outrage. How dare you besmirch a Mexican folk hero? even though Murrieta's career as a murdering bandit is well documented. It's an outrage that smacks of Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden. Where is the self-righteous defense of the Asian people that Joaquin and his gang thrill-killed by the nearly dozens in a 2-month period of 1853? If anyone can send me a medium.com think piece about that, please do, kindamurdery@gmail.com. Forgive me, I obviously feel pretty strongly about this. So again, the first place that the reality of Joaquin Murrieta intersects with the legend is, yes, he did have a racial motivation for his murders, but it wasn't the hatred of oppressive white people. It was the thrill killing of Chinese people. The second place it intersects is the reward. As it turned out, Harry did, in fact, receive a reward for stopping Murrieta. After Murrieta's death, leaders from the San Francisco Chinese community presented Love with a $1,000 check, about 50 grand today, to show their appreciation to the Ranger for finally stopping the notorious outlaw who had wholesale murdered so many members of their community for fun. Perhaps no real-life legend has ever been so undeserving of a noble backstory and a hero's mantle as Joaquin Murrieta, the Robin Hood of El Dorado. Was the legend of Zorro inspired by a hate crime killer? The answer is yes. But I'm not about to cancel Zorro. It's not Don Diego de la Vega's fault that he exists as a Disneyfication of a much darker historical truth. Let Don Diego be. As for the real-life Zorro, the legend of Joaquin Murrieta, the Bandit King of California, as invented by John Rollin Ridge, it's an inspiring fable. Very nearly a carbon copy of Robin Hood transported across the pond with an identity updated to reflect the local population. And if you love it, you can keep it. There just isn't enough truth in there to justify offending anyone. But remember, the real Joaquin Murrieta was a bloodthirsty, hate-murdering psychopath. And his legend is as much a fairy tale as a TV show or a movie about a black-clad hero armed with whips and rapiers carving the letter Z on the flesh of evildoers. I'm Zevin Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery. If you've enjoyed today's Kinda Murdery, please tell your friends and family, tell strangers, leave a review. It's the best way to ensure that I can keep telling that special brand of bizarre and terrible tales that you'll only find here on Kinda Murdery.